until last week, wildfires and public safety power shutoffs were like the craziest thing in energy, right?
Right.
And our company's been following this for a while because this really started back in like 2017. I want to say that was. I mean, public safety power shutoffs have been a thing for a while. They've been used, but just very sparingly. But with the increased frequency of wildfires in California, being, some of them sparked by downed utility lines, this has become in the 2017-2018 season. The utilities talked about this and said we're going to have to start doing this more. And like, I want to be clear, like we believe them, like they're right. Like there's a lot of folks who are saying, no, you're just not doing your job. Blah, blah. No, they're protecting the state from being burned down. Of course, an impact of that though is people lose power more often. And we tried to get out in front of this. Prior to this, we weren't pursuing any projects in California because it was just a very different market than what we were used to. We were kind of doing our own thing here on the East Coast. But since then, late 2017 into 2018, we've been really focusing a ton of our attention there. And like scarily enough, it sort of just keeps getting worse each year, right? And I don't actually have all the latest statistics like in my head at this moment, but I think it was the very first DER task force presentation.
I was just going to say that. It's our OG presentation.
Yeah, right. I should say New York City, NYC DERS meetup. And at the time, like the crazy stat was the year before, largest wildfire season, most destruction of property, most deaths, all records. Next year, most fire, most destruction, most property damage, most deaths. So it's as if it keeps sort of one-upping itself. And yeah, I think like after the first year, the question was like, is this the new normal? Like, are people going to like change behaviors and find new solutions? After the second year, it was kind of like, ooh, this is looking like it's the new normal. And after the third year, people are figuring this out. Like I mentioned earlier, in all variety of ways, not all ways that are great for the rest of our energy goals. Like, again, I always have to stress this. Diesel backup generators are the number one solution to this that's happening right now. So finding out how to, make that better is, a big challenge, but like people are doing it and it's pretty cool. Like, for the past 6 or 7 years, there've been all these RFPs for like school districts in California that want to get solar just because the economics make sense. All of them are including storage now, or at least all the ones I've seen. And the consultants running those RFPs are smart. They understand this stuff and like they're doing detailed analysis to figure out what makes sense. And then, sort of bringing the hammer to people like me who are trying to reply to these RFPs, right? And like really, they know what they're doing. And it's not because they went to battery school or something. It's because like they had to figure it out, right? So I think, yeah, what's happening in California now because of this is like, it's not just sort of the immediate impact of just like, yeah, more batteries are being deployed. While that is true, it's like it is forcing the industry to move a lot faster than was kind of the business as usual path of like, yeah, batteries are getting cheaper, we can start to consider them. Now like the biggest economy in the US and one of the biggest ones in the world has spun up an industry that really gets this stuff and is moving. So that's been my like biggest takeaway from this is just like, whoa, like we can actually like learn and move fast if there's like something behind us that's, forcing us to.
Yeah, I think that's super, super interesting, Duncan. I think for me, like, so as someone who is very far removed from like the business side of this and also has been like terrified of living in California my whole life because I was scared of earthquakes. And then like the fire started happening. And I was like, I hear it's great. I love my friends who live there, but oh my goodness, natural disasters are like on my biggest list of fears, just like in general. And like the Northeast, like only blizzards, or that's like the only thing I can handle. But I think what I find, so it's like, right, we have a lot of people going out and buying diesel backup, which is obviously like, people need power, right? Like as we've seen in way too many instances, like lack of power can lead to really bad things for people and can lead to death, right? Which is like, it is worth it to get a diesel backup. Like, I totally get that. We have awesome companies like Scale out there being like, all right, let's try to like not just do diesel. Let's like try to do some other things. And then where I start getting like, okay, like how do we make this work is in those communities that are like in the forest, right? Because again, I'm not going to pretend to be a California expert, but like I think we've all heard enough times that there's like part of the problem amongst many other things is like deeper and deeper build into forested areas, that then you have these like lines that are running through these really big forested areas. It's very difficult. Like, how do you build community level microgrids and like shared resources in those areas so that you either don't need that line or you have that line, but when you have public safety power shut off, it's like not a big deal because you have this other power there, and that line's really there as like backup for when you need it. And for me, like that's I think the big thing that like people kind of talk about, but it's so complicated because like it gets into, James isn't here, but I'll just like be both myself and James because we fight about this all the time, utility franchise rights. This like question of like, is that something that utilities like, should PG&E be going out there and like allowed to like build or incentivize DERs getting built and like helping understand how that infrastructure connects there so that there is backup power? Is that something the private market should be handling? And like we allow for certain instances where like if you're in a public safety, like high public safety risk area, then you are like allowed to procure this like secondary backup, like that conversation and how DERs can solve that. Because I think ultimately for me, I struggle with like individual backup is great, but it's like inherently unequal because it's going to people who can afford it, and it's going to people who are credit worthy, and it's going to people maybe who can get grants. And so like I don't think it's the right, I think it's the best short-term solution, but I don't think it's the right solution. And I would love to see a lot more like holistic discussion around that. And I know it does happen, right? Like after every, New Jersey has community microgrid programs, New York has community microgrid programs, Massachusetts does, California has a bunch. And like, how many of those have actually gotten built? Is I think zero, yeah. And it's a really, really difficult thing to process because there's all these questions on like who pays, who maintains, like is it something that the community gets, or is like if there's a school, like should it be paid by all of the people, even if they like all the people in that utility service territory because they could drive to the school and like have power and an outage? Like how do you think about the community benefit? And this is something we talk about in our podcast a lot because I think we're all super interested in it and come at it from like very various angles. But for me, like that's like I don't want to say like the magic bullet, but like that's the solution that I think we like need to figure out.
So I totally agree. Like, and I think there's a lot of interesting ways to think about this. It gets particularly tricky, I think, with residential, right? So like we focus on commercial and industrial because it's kind of easy to say like the hospital needs its own power source when there's an outage, right? Or, beyond
there's some
that
like
too,
equity though, like built in to a lot of those
exactly,
things because
right?
there's universal access.
We've been working with a lot of water utilities, like the water treatment plant needs a good source of power, right? Or the pumping station. But I even sort of downstream of that, like the grocery store needs power, right? Like that is a essential part of a community.
I mean, I know we're in California right now, and we'll stay there because I want to hear the rest of your point, Duncan. But like HEB has gotten so much love again in the past week from Texas for having power and like staying open during outages. And every time there's an outage in Texas, everyone's just like, there's always like the HEB promo.
Yeah, this is like in my sales pitch now, which is just like the brand power of staying open through an outage is awesome. I've yet to convince anyone of that, but I think it's true. What I was getting at though, right, is like, so there are like, I think quite a number of like single building microgrids that make sense even from the equity consideration. But your point is right, which is like, that doesn't cover everything we need to cover, right? And I think there's really interesting emerging ideas about how to accomplish that. Um, that are kind of like run the gamut of how this could work. But I mean, even a year ago, Sunrun released this white paper of how you could use customer sited DERs, single building, rooftop solar and storage to power a whole feeder during an outage, right? And it's really cool because there's a bunch of work for the utility to do, and then there's a bunch of work for the individual sources to do. And I mean, I'm not a power engineer, so I'm not going to get too far into this because I'll probably just make a mistake. But essentially, right, the idea was like, if you have a block of homes on a feeder, you isolate the feeder, which means the utility has to have like cool stuff on that feeder to make that happen, and like better sensors and switches and stuff. So there's kind of like things for the utility to play in this. And then rather than have all these homes self-isolate, now they're little communities isolated, and you have all of these systems talk to each other and manage load. It's just a small grid, right? And the fact that the solar and storage is located on somebody's roof is kind of irrelevant, right? Some people will have it, some people won't, but they'd share the power, right? Just like that's how our grid works now. It's not as if, New York City has all of its own generation, and no, we all share, right? So I think that's one really interesting model. The other one then is the kind of like upstream microgrid, right? So you could have all of the generation and storage, at the point that feeder is being isolated, and then just feed it downstream. And then, you just have to figure out like what that thing's doing, the 99% of the other hours. Like that's the whole thing with resilience. It's like, how can I give people what they need, but like also have this be economically useful and like have people want to do it, or like have the system, the utility want to do it. I don't know. I agree with your main point, which is just like, this makes everybody's head explode. Like there's
right.
no,
it's like really hard. There's no easy
Yeah.
answer, but it's also like kind of obvious that it's a good idea. Like that,
Well,
like the end.
Yeah, and I think the best one, it's a little bit different, but just and the big thing obviously in this case is the cost of energy is so high. But what they did in Australia, kind of it was in partnership, the virtual power plant kind of setup they did with a lot of homes by the utility just paying to put the actual Tesla Powerwall thing in someone's house, and then kind of put those in conjunction to kind of help with a lot of the blackouts issues they were having. I think that to me, once again, there's a huge economic factor, but then it does start to make it a lot more approachable where the person themselves doesn't have to buy it, and the utility is being able to kind of get the return on it and get that the one who monitors it. But it's kind of that seamless experience where no one who has these things in their homes really realize where the energy is going. They just know they don't have blackouts, and their costs have come wildly down for their whole, I guess, neighborhood for the most part.
Yeah, I think that one in Vermont is really cool.
Yeah, and that's kind of a similar I don't think it's the same scale, but it's exactly kind of the same idea.
Yeah, it's a different version of like, how can we take customer-sided resources but make sure they have social value? And really what they're doing is making sure the day-to-day economics have social value, right? Because they're using those batteries to like reduce the system's peak load and discharge at the right times and stuff. And then the individual gets the backup, because they are isolated like one building systems.
With the one in Vermont, or
with the Green Mountain Power one, like if you have one of those Tesla batteries in your house that Green Mountain Power gave you, like it only provides backup to your home, but it provides economic benefits to everybody else during the rest of the year. So it's like flipping the question on its head, right? Which is, we want social value out of these systems. We don't want to just have a bunch of like little atomic grids and nobody cares about each other, right?
Right.
You can also spin it the other way, which is, if people are going to spend money on their own resilience, how can we make sure that also provides benefits to everybody else during, I always say this, the 99% of the other hours of the year? I think that's a cool model as well.
Yeah.
I might be mistaken. Maybe the Australia one's that way too. I thought it was a little bit different, but that actually probably makes more sense that they did it that way.
We might be referring to different things too. I might have just totally went off on a tangent there.
Yeah,
but you're right. It makes everyone's heads explode trying to figure this out. But what were you gonna say, Colleen?
Yeah, no, I was gonna say just closing out on that idea. What I think is like interesting about both of those too is that yes, it's not like necessarily creating and maybe in the Australia one it is, in the Vermont one it's not necessarily creating like a community microgrid outage, but it does make it a lot more accessible to people who couldn't have afforded it otherwise, because then they can derive additional value. And then for people who are like really wealthy and are like, I want control over my battery 100%, they don't have to participate in the program. But it does open it up to more people. Like, I think there's still a nominal enough fee that probably doesn't open up to everyone, but it's like getting better. So I think that's, Duncan, a really good point as well.
And then we also have to like layer on, like, anytime we're talking about energy technology, we have to think about cost curves, right? Like, we can't like level set our ideas of how this works today, because like 100%. A year from now is different, 5 years from now is really different, 10 years from now, like, how cheap is storage going to be? I have no idea, but while watching the solar cost curve happen, I was wrong every single time. I was like pessimistic 5 years ago about solar, which turned out to be the dumbest take ever. So I don't know. It's one more thing that makes this so hard to think through, which is like, you just can't really think about today. You have to think about like 10 years from now if you want to really like create a good framework for how this stuff should work.
And you're completely right, because it kind of goes back to what you both said. None of this happens overnight. And I think, especially speaking of solar, I remember when we did both large commercial, some utility, and then we had a smaller section that did residential. And like a good deal on a residential project would be like $8 a watt, which now is just, yeah. Oh yeah. And that was like 08, 09. And nowadays it's so economically inefficient. Whereas now I know it's at least under $2, but it's probably even lower than that for just even residential.
I think resi still kind of tends to hit like high 2s or 3s even.
Gotcha.
I mean, I think what's wild is, right, like the Sunshot program, the DOE's Sunshot program was to get like 100 megawatt utility scale plants down to $1 a watt, right? And that was achieved, I don't know, a few years ago. I just did a very small commercial solar installation, so like 150 kilowatts in New Jersey, and it was $1.34 a watt, right? Like, so whatever people were thinking about at the DOE, which was amazing, by the way, and was like they achieved their goals about like what that would unlock, like they were missing this whole other thing, right? Because you just don't expect this to happen. So I don't know. I feel like everybody in our industry, myself included, has been caught like time and time again underestimating like how technology actually changes everything we think about.
And I think it's completely, what I'm most fascinated right now about is battery costs, because it reminds me of exactly that with solar, but maybe a few years behind, where it is just dropping so quickly that data you have from a year, maybe even 18 months ago, is just not worth using, because the prices, depending on what chemistry you're using and the general production of it, have completely dropped even further.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to visit our website, connectingthegrid.com. There you can listen to our podcasts, contact us about sponsorship, or even be a guest on Grid Connections. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a positive rating on your favorite podcast or video streaming service. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out a lot too. Thank you again, and I look forward to us learning more together soon.